I never thought a number could change the way I saw myself. Yet here I am, staring at my bank account on the dim glow of my laptop screen, heart hammering in a way that feels almost like anticipation and dread wrapped into one. 2 zeros, 5 zeros, a blinking cursor taunting me, more money than I've ever held at once. It wasn't just money. It was a key, a door to something I'd buried under years of quiet denial. I had spent my life performing the version of myself the world demanded, a version safe, predictable, invisible. But this balance, this absurd, obscene balance, offered me freedom I had never dared imagine. I clicked, hesitated, and typed a payment into an online boutique I'd been watching for months. Silk skirts, delicate blouses, the kind of lingerie you only see in magazines with glossy pages and impossible models. I wasn't even sure what I was hoping for, perhaps to feel different, perhaps to see if the reflection staring back in the mirror would actually recognize me as me. The confirmation pinged, and a shiver ran down my spine, a mixture of fear and exhilaration. This was reckless, foolish even. But for the first time in years, I felt a spark of joy that wasn't fleeting. The parcels arrived over the next week, stacked neatly on my apartment floor. Each one felt heavier than the last, laden not just with fabric, but with possibility. I tore open the first box with trembling hands, the scent of perfume and fine cotton filling the air. I held up the skirt, its softness against my fingers electric, and my reflection in the nearby mirror caught me off guard. There is something thrilling about imagining myself in these clothes, imagining the curves and lines of a version of me I had only dared to sketch in secret thoughts. I changed, slowly, tentatively. Button by button, zipper by zipper, I slid into this new skin. My hands lingered on the fabric, on the way it moved, the way it clung and flowed. I looked in the mirror and barely recognized the person staring back. The angles of my jaw softened under the flattering cut of the blouse. The skirt fell just above my knees, fluttering like it had its own heartbeat. My reflection felt alive, almost mischievous, like it was daring me to step fully into it. And in that moment, alone and shaking, I realized I wanted more. I wanted this not just for an hour, not just in secret, but as a new reality. I stood there for what felt like hours, letting the mirror's reflection wash over me, tracing every line, every curve, every tiny detail that suddenly felt alive. It wasn't just the clothes. It was the way they made me feel, the quiet thrill of inhabiting a version of myself I had never allowed in daylight. My hands shook as I ran them over the silk of the blouse, the softness of the skirt brushing my legs, and for a moment, I wondered if this was a dream. But the weight of the packages, the lingering scent of new fabric, the faint hum of the city outside my window, they insisted it was real. I experimented cautiously at first. I practiced walking, the skirt swaying just right, my posture aligning in a way that felt natural but entirely foreign. My voice caught when I whispered to myself, mimicking the tone I imagined would fit this new self, the voice soft but firm, hesitant but undeniably mine. I laughed quietly at how absurd I must look from the outside, an awkward, trembling figure discovering herself, but the laughter was laced with something more profound than amusement, relief. Relief at finally acknowledging a truth I had spent years denying. The more I looked, the more I noticed the subtle changes. My shoulders seemed narrower. The way the blouse clung made my chest seem fuller, and the skirt emphasized hips I didn't know I had. Each adjustment, each small tug at a seam, felt like sculpting the person I had always been inside but never allowed to exist. And yet, the thrill came with tension. Part of me recoiled at how visible this transformation was, how fragile this new identity felt. What would happen if anyone found out? Would they laugh, judge, or worse, ignore me? But the money, the absurdly large number in my bank account, felt like a shield, a token of power I hadn't known I possessed. Every purchase I made, heels that pinched my feet, silk gloves, delicate jewelry, was a step further into this new version of me. And with every package, every layer, every tiny adjustment, I felt less like the person who had stared at an empty mirror for so many years and more like someone stepping into the world with her own name, her own presence. I began experimenting with makeup. The first time I brushed the lipstick across my lips, I froze, unsure if I was daring to cross some invisible line. But the color was perfect, bold, unapologetic, yet not gaudy, and it awakened something inside me. I traced the shape of my eyes with liner, careful yet trembling, and watched as shadows and highlights reshaped the face I had always known as masculine. I almost didn't recognize the soft contours, the faint curve of cheekbones, the way the light caught the shimmer on my eyelids. The person in the mirror wasn't entirely me, yet it was not me either. It was the essence of who I had always been, now refusing to stay hidden. The first time I ventured outside, I felt exposed and exhilarated in equal measure. Sidewalks stretched before me like runways, every passerby a potential witness, every glance a possible judgment. I walked cautiously at first, then with more confidence, letting the skirt sway naturally with each step. Strangers' eyes barely lingered, yet I felt the weight of their perception pressing against me like a physical force. And in that pressure, I discovered a strange kind of liberation. The world hadn't changed, I had. The courage wasn't in hiding anymore, it was in showing up, fully and unafraid. Yet even as I reveled in this new self, there were nights when doubt gnawed at me. I would remove the clothes, the makeup, the carefully curated persona, and stare at the reflection of the person I had always been expected to be. The contrast was jarring, sometimes painful, and I would wonder if I was chasing an illusion. But then I remembered the packages, the deliberate choices, the way my body responded, and I knew it wasn't an illusion. It was a slow, deliberate unveiling, a truth wrapped in silk and color, demanding recognition. I began documenting the changes, not online, not for anyone else, but in a journal I kept beside my bed. I wrote every detail. The first time a skirt brushed my knees just right, the exact shade of blush that made my eyes shine, the way my voice wavered when I dared to speak softly. It wasn't vanity, it was acknowledgement. It was the act of claiming myself, piece by piece, stitch by stitch, note by note. The narrative of my life was rewriting itself, and the currency, the absurd, transformative balance in my bank account, was the pen guiding me toward the story I had always been too afraid to tell. Evenings stretched long as I experimented further. I discovered the thrill of color combinations, of textures, of layers, each one an extension of identity I had long suppressed. I practiced gestures in front of the mirror, the tilt of my head, the subtle arch of an eyebrow, the sway of a hand as I moved. Each movement felt revolutionary, intimate, and deeply personal. It was as if every suppressed desire, every muted feeling from years past, was now finding a conduit in the way I expressed myself outwardly. And yet, beneath the joy, there remained tension, social fear, the uncertainty of acceptance, the fragility of self-image, but the temptation of fully becoming her was stronger, undeniable. I started to dream of public spaces, not crowded plazas, not theaters, not even offices, but small, intimate cafes, quiet streets where I could test this self in the world, see how she moved, how she existed without judgment. The anticipation was electric, almost unbearable. Each day, each outfit, each experiment felt like preparation for a debut I had never dared to imagine. And with every test, every tiny victory, a smile from a stranger, a moment of unnoticed confidence, I felt her taking root, the version of me I had been desperate to honor finally stepping forward. The first time I walked through the city, wearing a full outfit I had meticulously chosen myself, I felt like a stranger in my own skin. But not in the way I had feared. It wasn't uncomfortable, it was electric, terrifying, and liberating all at once. Each step echoed differently. Each movement carried a weight of attention I wasn't accustomed to, and my heart raced like a drumbeat I could feel in my chest. I caught my reflection in the glass windows of shops and nearly stumbled at the sight. The girl staring back at me was undeniably me, but also entirely new. My lips, the shade of deep rose, glistened under the afternoon sun. The skirt swayed with each step, soft silk brushing against my legs, and my blouse's delicate folds framed my shoulders like armor. Inside, I waged war with myself. Part of me screamed that I was ridiculous, foolish, that I would be laughed at if anyone truly looked. Another part whispered that I was exactly where I was supposed to be, finally stepping into a life that had been waiting for me. The duality was exhausting, but thrilling. I felt it in my hands, trembling slightly as I adjusted the hem of the skirt, in the way my chest rose and fell, in the subtle shift of my gait. Each movement became an experiment, a test of how the world would react to the woman I had been hiding for so long. At a cafe, I sat alone, nervously twisting a napkin in my hands. The waiter smiled politely, oblivious to the storm inside me, and I realized that perhaps the world wasn't as harsh as I had imagined. The skirt, the blouse, the shoes, they weren't shields to hide behind. They were extensions of myself, amplifying a confidence I had never been allowed to express. I laughed quietly at the absurdity, the fear, the liberation all tangled together. I wasn't just cross-dressing, I was transforming, layer by layer, into someone I had always known existed in my heart. But the transformation wasn't seamless. Returning home, I would sometimes strip off the clothes, stare at the reflection of the version of myself the world had known, and feel a pang of grief. Who was that person? Who had I been for so long? The financial freedom, the packages, the silk, the colors, they had allowed me to experiment. Yes, but they hadn't erased the years of invisibility. I carried those years inside me, etched into my posture, my voice, my hesitations. And yet, with every outfit, every brush of lipstick, every practiced gesture, I felt the old self softening, melting into this new life that demanded recognition. The money I had spent, it wasn't vanity. It was currency for liberation, for exploration, for finally stepping into the body I had only ever glimpsed in the mirror of my imagination. Each package arriving at my door felt like a small declaration. This is your chance. Each new blouse, skirt, pair of shoes whispered, try me, see yourself, own it. And I did. I explored, I hesitated, I repeated mistakes, I laughed at awkwardness, and I celebrated tiny victories. The way my heels clicked against the floor, the way the skirt swung naturally, the way my hands traced my new curves with awe rather than shame. Friends began to notice subtle changes. Some commented innocently on my style, others on my demeanor. The attention was a mix of thrilling and terrifying. I felt exposed, vulnerable, and yet more myself than ever. Conversations became exercises in courage, answering questions about my appearance, explaining choices with a calm I didn't entirely feel. Each interaction was a test of authenticity, a battle between who I had been conditioned to be and who I was becoming. And with each successful encounter, the reflection in the mirror grew stronger, bolder, more alive. One evening, alone in my apartment, I allowed myself to fully step into her identity. I put on my most elegant outfit yet, carefully applied makeup, and examined every detail in the mirror. The soft curl of my hair, the precise sweep of eyeliner, the delicate way my skirt fell over my legs. It was a portrait of self-discovery, painstakingly curated but wholly natural. I realized I had spent years suppressing not just desires, but a version of my soul. The reflection staring back was no longer an experiment. It was a declaration. Tears filled my eyes as I whispered to her, to myself, "You are real. You exist. You belong." The words tasted like liberation, and for the first time, I felt the layers of fear, doubt, and shame peeling away, leaving clarity and pride in their place. My heart raced not with anxiety, but with anticipation for a life lived fully, unapologetically, visibly. And yet, the tension remained. I was discovering that freedom had a price. Social interactions, expectations, old habits, they clung to me like shadows. But each challenge became a lesson, each hesitation a reminder of the strength I carried inside. I found beauty in imperfection, in the slight wobble of heels, in the nervous laugh when someone complimented me, in the quiet adjustment of a sleeve as I moved. These moments were intimate, private triumphs that no one else could see, but they shaped me more profoundly than any external validation ever could. The transformation began to seep beyond clothing and makeup. I noticed changes in how I thought, how I processed the world. I became more attuned to subtleties, to emotions, to the quiet beauty of ordinary moments. My voice softened naturally, gestures became more fluid, and I discovered a confidence rooted not in appearance alone, but in acceptance of self. Money had bought me materials, but it had also bought me courage, the courage to explore, to risk, to evolve. I began to dream bigger. Not just cafes, not just streets, but entire experiences, gatherings, celebrations, moments in public where I could fully inhabit her identity. Fear whispered constantly, but excitement roared louder. Every morning, I woke eager to step into the reflection, to polish every detail, to test boundaries, to embrace the exhilaration of becoming. And in those quiet, private hours before the world intruded, I felt the deepest peace I had ever known. She was no longer an idea. She was a living, breathing part of me, sculpted by courage, creativity, and yes, by the absurd power of that bank account that had first offered the key. I woke that morning with a strange, fluttering excitement in my chest, a sensation that had become familiar, yet still felt electric every time it appeared. The sunlight spilled across my apartment floor, falling on the neatly arranged outfits I had laid out the night before. I traced the folds of a new skirt with trembling fingers, marveling at the silky texture, the way it caught the light. My reflection in the mirror already seemed more confident than it had days ago, yet there was still a tension in my shoulders, a reminder that this version of myself was still learning how to exist in the world without apology. I dressed slowly, deliberately, savoring each step. The blouse, soft and flowing, slipped over my arms and settled across my shoulders like it had been made for me, which in some way it had. The skirt hugged my hips gently, teasingly, making me aware of curves I had never acknowledged before. Shoes clicked against the hardwood as I paced briefly, feeling the rhythm of a life I was constructing piece by piece. My hands lingered on my hair, smoothing stray strands, adjusting the subtle curl I had spent hours perfecting. When I finally looked in the mirror, I didn't just see clothing or makeup. I saw her, fully, undeniably her. Venturing outside that day felt different. Not because the world had changed, but because I had. Every step carried a confidence that had been absent before, though it was still punctuated by hesitation, by the echo of years spent hiding. People passed by, unremarkable in their presence, but I felt as if I were walking through a field of eyes, each glance a potential test. Yet the thrill outweighed the fear. I noticed the way my skirt swayed, the subtle grace in my movements, the way strangers occasionally offered polite smiles, oblivious to the personal revolution unfolding within me. It was intoxicating, and I felt myself slipping further and further into her skin, losing the edges of the old self with every stride. Back home, I sat in front of my mirror and allowed myself a moment to reflect, literally and figuratively. The journey wasn't just physical, it was emotional, psychological, spiritual even. Each purchase, each choice of fabric or color, had been a bridge into understanding the self I had long denied. I traced my fingers along my cheeks, marveling at the softness, at the subtle contouring that made my reflection glow. My lips, kissed with a perfect shade of pink, curved naturally into a smile that felt like liberation incarnate. I whispered her name softly, a private acknowledgement of the person I had nurtured into existence, and felt a shiver of affirmation. She is real. I am real. We belong. The world outside became both a playground and a challenge. I experimented with cafes, parks, quiet streets, even small social gatherings where I could test her presence. Each encounter was layered with tension and delight. Would someone recognize the old me beneath the new? Would they judge? Or would they simply see her, accept her, allow her to exist? The anxiety was sharp, almost painful, yet it mingled with exhilaration. I reveled in subtle victories. The way a compliment felt like sunlight warming a long-frozen garden, the way my movements elicited no ridicule, the quiet acknowledgement of my reflection in shop windows or puddles as I passed. I also began experimenting with my voice more intentionally. In private, I practiced speaking with a softness, a rhythm, a lilt that felt natural yet distinctly feminine. Sometimes I faltered, slipping into old tones that felt foreign and wrong, but over time, the new cadence became my own. I recorded myself, listening to the transformation not just in sight but in sound, in the vibrations that carried my identity outward. Each day, she grew more coherent, more complete, more undeniably alive. There were moments of doubt, as there always were. Nights when I removed the carefully curated attire, stared at the reflection of my old self, and felt the sharp sting of loss. Loss for the years I had denied her, for the fears that had kept me hidden. The juxtaposition was brutal, one self vibrant, illuminated by silk, color, and the thrill of existence, the other, muted, reserved, cautious, a shadow I could no longer inhabit without pain. Yet the recognition of that tension became a source of strength. To know the old self was still there, lingering, meant I could honor her history without being trapped by it. I was learning to balance, to integrate, to allow both to coexist, but with the new self taking center stage. The financial freedom that had ignited this transformation continued to play a subtle role, not as indulgence, but as empowerment. Each purchase, each accessory, each carefully chosen outfit was a declaration of intent. Money wasn't the creation, it was the fuel. The true artistry was in the act of becoming, in the patience, in the courage to experiment, fail, adjust, and rise again. I became meticulous in documenting every detail, the exact shade of blush that made my eyes shine, the particular length of skirt that swayed just right, the softness of gloves against my skin. It was an intimate devotion, a dialogue with myself, a slow unveiling of a truth I had long suppressed. Friends began noticing changes more consistently. Casual remarks. "You look different today. That color suits you. You seem lighter somehow," were loaded with curiosity, sometimes confusion, but always with warmth. Their reactions forced me to confront the social realities of becoming her, to navigate questions of perception and authenticity. I realized that transformation wasn't just about the reflection in the mirror. It was about inhabiting a world that had always seen me differently, learning to assert her presence confidently without shame. Late nights became sacred rituals. I would sit in soft lamplight, makeup brushes in hand, lipstick poised, clothing perfectly arranged, and allow myself to truly inhabit her. These were moments of intimacy with myself, with my identity, moments when the old fears dissolved into a quiet, resonant joy. I whispered affirmations, traced every contour of my face, practiced gestures, rehearsed movements. The reflection became animated, not just a mirror image, but a living companion, a reminder of courage, beauty, and resilience. And yet, the transformation wasn't linear. Some days were victories, others were struggles. There were moments when fear, doubt, and exhaustion threatened to overwhelm the exhilaration. But each obstacle, each moment of hesitation, only reinforced the depth of my commitment. I was learning patience, grace, self-compassion, and above all, the unshakable truth that becoming her wasn't just an act. It was a reclamation, a declaration, a life rewritten with courage, curiosity, and meticulous care. By the end of the month, the person I saw in the mirror was no longer a reflection of fantasy or experimentation. She was fully realized, confident in presence and spirit, tangible in every movement and glance, alive in a way that made the old self feel like a memory, bittersweet but honored. I had crossed thresholds I hadn't dared imagine, and with every passing day, every carefully chosen outfit, every meticulously applied brushstroke of makeup, I felt the profound, unstoppable joy of becoming who I had always been. It wasn't long before the world began to notice, not in glaring, dramatic ways, but in subtle, undeniable shifts. Friends, colleagues, acquaintances, all began responding to me differently. Some glanced briefly, politely, and moved on, but others lingered, eyes flicking with curiosity or admiration. Every interaction became an intricate dance, a test of authenticity, courage, and poise. The thrill of recognition mingled with fear. Part of me wanted to shrink, to retreat into the familiar shadows of my former self, while another, louder, more insistent part demanded, step forward. Be seen. Be her. I remember one particular evening, walking into a small boutique I had frequented in my former guise. The clerk looked up, paused mid-step, and smiled, a little longer than usual. You look different. Nice, she said, with genuine warmth. My chest tightened, not from vanity, but from a surge of emotion I couldn't quite name. She had acknowledged her, the version of me I had meticulously built with silk, color, and patience. It was terrifying, exhilarating, humbling. I wanted to run, to hide, to revert to the old persona I knew would never disappoint or draw attention. And yet I stayed. I held my head high, shoulders back, and felt an unfamiliar, glorious certainty. This is me. No apologies. No hiding. Social situations became exercises in delicate navigation. Lunchtime conversations, casual greetings, even minor encounters at the corner store, all carried the weight of dual perception. Would someone recognize the old me lurking beneath the surface? Would they question my choices? Would they accept her, the new self, as fully as I had dared to love her? Anxiety gnawed at the edges, yet with every successful interaction, confidence accumulated like coins in a jar. Each compliment, each subtle acknowledgement, each moment of unnoticed grace became proof. She existed fully, authentically, and the world was capable of recognizing her. I became acutely aware of how small gestures shaped perception. The tilt of a head, the soft inflection in my voice, the deliberate sway of a skirt, all became tools, subtle expressions of a self I had only recently learned to inhabit. My hands, once clumsy in their movements, now brushed through hair, adjusted collars, and rested with quiet elegance on surfaces, each motion a declaration of presence. And still, beneath it all, fear lingered, a shadow, persistent yet less oppressive with each passing day. Evenings at home were sacred. I would stand before the mirror, fully dressed, fully made up, and allow her to exist without restraint. I practiced gestures, expressions, and subtle nuances that made her wholly alive. I experimented with new combinations of clothing, textures, colors, and accessories, reveling in the alchemy of transformation. Each choice carried meaning, a deliberate act of creation. Money had purchased the materials, yes, but it was the attention, patience, and courage that forged her soul. There were moments of tension that felt unbearable. Friends who hadn't seen me in months occasionally mistook her for someone else entirely, their startled recognition brushing against my core like a delicate shock. I sometimes had to navigate the line between truth and explanation carefully, balancing honesty with self-protection. Each misstep was a lesson, each success a quiet triumph. And through it all, the reflection in the mirror grew more complete, more confident, more luminous. The most intense challenge came unexpectedly. I had been invited to a small social gathering, a mix of friends, acquaintances, and strangers. Anxiety clawed at me for days. Could she survive scrutiny? Could I navigate questions, whispers, glances without faltering? On the night itself, I dressed with meticulous care. Every element was deliberate. The skirt that swayed just so, the blouse that softened my shoulders, the shoes that clicked confidently against the floor. Makeup enhanced without exaggeration, hair curled naturally, accessories subtle but elegant. I felt like armor, and yet every layer was also a confession. This is me. Take it or leave it. Arriving at the gathering, I felt every gaze, conscious and unconscious, like tiny currents against my skin. Conversations flowed, and I carefully inserted myself, practicing intonation, posture, gestures. The first few minutes were tense, I tripped over words, laughed too loudly, adjusted my skirt obsessively. But gradually, the anxiety softened. Laughter came naturally. Compliments were met with grace. Curiosity was answered with confidence. By the end of the night, I had fully occupied the space, no longer half-hidden, no longer hesitant, but present, vivid, undeniable, and radiant. Returning home afterward, the reflection in the mirror was almost intoxicating. I traced contours, adjusted hair, smiled at the subtle movement of the skirt. There was triumph here, yes, but also revelation. She wasn't just an image or costume. She was alive. Her existence was rooted in courage, in patience, in deliberate acts of creation. The journey had been long, sometimes painful, but the reward was profound. A self reclaimed, a life rewritten, a voice finally heard. Yet transformation, I realized, wasn't merely external. It seeped into thought, into perception, into the rhythm of daily existence. I noticed subtleties previously invisible, the way light caught on soft fabrics, the delicate arch of a passing eyebrow, the ripple of acknowledgement in a fleeting glance. I became attuned to nuance, to emotion, to the understated poetry of living fully in her skin. Every decision, every action, every reflection in glass or water became a meditation, a celebration, a proof of authenticity. And as I lay in bed that night, reflecting on the journey so far, I felt a quiet awe. The money, the silk, the makeup, all had been instruments, yes, but the transformation had been internal, psychological, spiritual. I had uncovered layers of courage, patience, and self-compassion I hadn't known existed. I had learned to navigate fear, to embrace attention, to cultivate presence. And most importantly, I had discovered a profound truth. She wasn't temporary, experimental, or borrowed. She was enduring. She was whole. She was me. The morning sunlight spilled across my room, warm and golden, and for a moment, I simply sat on the edge of my bed, letting it wash over me. It had been months since that first moment of hesitation in front of my mirror, months since I had dared to experiment with silk and color, months since the absurdly large number in my bank account had offered me the first key to becoming her. And now, as I traced my fingers along the curves and contours that I had sculpted, curated, and finally claimed as my own, I realized something extraordinary. I no longer needed permission. I no longer needed approval. She was fully me, and I was fully her. I dressed slowly that morning, savoring the tactile joy of fabric brushing against my skin. The skirt, soft and flowing, settled just above my knees. The blouse framed my shoulders elegantly, and the shoes clicked against the floor with a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat, steady and confident. I applied makeup with deliberate care, each stroke a meditation on self-love rather than performance. My hair fell in soft waves, perfectly imperfect, a crown for the version of myself I had fought to nurture into being. I looked in the mirror and smiled, truly smiled, not at the reflection, but at the life it represented. She was here. I was here. We were one. Stepping outside, the city felt different. Not because the world had changed, but because I had. Every glance, every interaction, every casual exchange was now an opportunity to live authentically. I walked with a grace that felt organic, unstudied yet deliberate, a manifestation of months of practice, courage, and patience. Strangers' eyes barely lingered, but even when they did, it no longer mattered. For the first time, I moved through the world not as a shadow of someone else's expectations, but as a complete, radiant presence of my own making. Social interactions that had once filled me with anxiety now became moments of quiet triumph. Friends who had watched me cautiously explore this new identity now embraced it with warmth. Compliments, observations, and casual remarks were no longer threats but affirmations. I found myself answering questions not with hesitation, not with half-truths, but with calm, measured confidence. Each conversation, each acknowledgement, each small recognition from the world reinforced the reality I had been building for months. She was real, visible and unshakable. And yet, the internal journey remained the most profound. There were still moments of quiet reflection, moments when I would remove the carefully curated attire and stare at the reflection of the person I had once been. But now, instead of grief or fear, there was gratitude. Gratitude for the years that had shaped me, for the patience that had carried me through experimentation, for the courage that had allowed me to fully inhabit her skin. I realized that transformation wasn't about erasing the past. It was about honoring it, learning from it, and using it as a foundation for something breathtakingly authentic. I began to notice the subtler changes as well. The confidence that lingered even when no one was watching, the grace in everyday gestures, the comfort of inhabiting a body and identity that felt completely aligned with my spirit. Money had provided the tools, yes, silk, fabric, makeup, accessories, but it was the choices, the patience, the courage, and the deliberate acts of self-expression that had truly forged her. She was not a costume or an experiment. She was living proof of resilience, creativity, and self-acceptance. One evening, as I stood in front of the mirror, softly lit by the warm glow of a lamp, I traced the curve of my cheek, adjusted a curl of hair, and whispered to her, "You are beautiful. You are real. You belong." And for the first time, the words felt like an undeniable truth, not a hopeful mantra.
She did belong.
I did belong. The years of hiding, the moments of doubt, the experiments, the awkward stumbles, all had been necessary to arrive at this profound clarity. The final piece of the transformation was not in the clothing, the makeup, or the gestures. It was in acceptance. Acceptance of the self I had long denied, of the courage I had cultivated, and of the life I had claimed. I no longer feared judgment, rejection, or misunderstanding. I understood that the world might not always see her as I did, but it didn't matter. What mattered was that I saw her fully, vividly, unflinchingly, and loved her completely. I left my apartment that evening dressed in my favorite ensemble, feeling the familiar sway of the skirt, the gentle brush of fabric, the confidence in my step. The city stretched before me, alive and indifferent, and I moved through it as a full participant, no longer tentative, no longer hiding, no longer divided. She was not just a reflection in a mirror. She was a living, breathing presence, fully integrated into every step, every thought, every breath. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of pink and gold, I realized the journey was ongoing, as all meaningful journeys are. There would still be challenges, moments of doubt, days that tested patience and courage. But there was also triumph, beauty, discovery, and joy, the thrill of inhabiting a life fully, authentically, unapologetically. I paused in a quiet street, feeling the soft sway of my skirt and the weight of presence that had once seemed impossible. I breathed in deeply, savoring the air, the moment, the life I had claimed. And in that perfect, fleeting instant, I understood something profound. The bank account had given me tools, silk, makeup, and opportunity, but it had been courage, patience, and love for myself that had made me her. The transformation was complete, not because the world had changed, but because I had. I smiled at my reflection in a shop window, soft and warm, a silent acknowledgement of the journey. We made it. We belong. We're whole. And for the first time, the mirror offered nothing but affirmation, nothing but truth, nothing but home.